Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time, we begin our reading of Storm in the Village by Miss Reed. Chapter 1. The Two Strangers. Miss Clare's thatched cottage lay comfortably behind a mixed hedge of hawthorn, privet, and honeysuckle on the outskirts of Beech Green. The village was a scattered one, unlike its neighbor Fairacre, where Miss Clare had been the infants' teacher for over 40 years, only relinquishing her post when ill health and the 2-mile bicycle journey proved too much for even her indomitable courage. The cottage had been Miss Clare's home for almost 60 years. Her father had been a thatcher by trade, and the crisscross decorations on the roof still testified to his skill, for they had been braving the weather for over 20 years, and stood out as clearly now on the graying thatched roof as they had on the first day of their golden glory. It was true that here and there, particularly round the squat red brick chimney, the roof was getting a little shabby. Miss Clare often looked at it ruefully, but when she went into the back garden to empty her teapot or cut a cabbage, as long as it remained weatherproof, she had decided that it must stay as it was. It would cost at least £200, she had been told, to rethatch her home, and that was out of the question. One breezy March morning, when the rooks were tumbling about the blue and white sky high above the cottage, Miss Clare was upstairs making her lodger's bed. A shaft of sunlight fell across the room, and Miss Clare's thin old hands smoothed the pillow and covered it squarely with the white honeycomb quilt which had once covered her mother's bed. No one could call Miss Jackson tidy, thought Miss Clare, as she returned books from the floor to the bookshelf and retrieved shoes from under the bed. It was one of the few things that grieved her about her young lodger. Otherwise, she was thoughtful and very, very clever with the children. Miss Clare imagined her now as she tidied the girls' clothes, standing in front of her class of young children, as she too had done for so many years at Fairacre School. Prayers would be over, and as it was so fine, no doubt they would be getting ready to go out into the playground for physical training. Often during the day, Miss Clare would look at the clock and think of the children at Fairacre School. The habits of a lifetime die hard, and to have the present infants' teacher as her lodger, to hear the school news and the gossip from the village, which secretly meant more to her than the one in which she lived, was a source of great comfort to her. She picked a small auburn feather from the floor. A Rhode Island Red's feather, noted Miss Clare's country eye, which must have worked its way from the plump feather bed. Outside, the birds were clamorous, busy with their nest building and reconnoitering for likely places in the loose parts of the thatched roof. Miss Clare crossed to the window and let the feather float from it to the little lawn below. Before it had time to settle, 3 excited sparrows threw themselves upon it, squabbling and struggling. Miss Clare, sunning herself on the window-sill, smiled benevolently upon them and watched her feather borne off in triumph to some half-made nest nearby. It was then that she noticed the men. There were 2 of them, pacing slowly, side by side, along the edge of the 100-acre field which lay on the other side of Miss Clare's garden hedge. It was one of several unusually large fields which formed part of old Mr. Miller's farm. Harold Miller had lived at the farmhouse at Springbourne all his life and had farmed the same land as his father before him. Now at 80, he was as spry as ever, and nothing escaped his bright bird-like eye. His 2 sons, much to his sorrow, had shown no desire to carry on the farming traditions of the family, but had sought their fortunes with fair success elsewhere, one as an engineer and the other as an architect. 100-acre Field and its spacious neighbors were among the more fruitful parts of Mr. Miller's farm. Many of his acres were on the bare chalk downs which sheltered his home from the northerly winds. Here he kept a sizable flock of sheep, rightly renowned for many miles around. At the foot of the downs, the plow soon turned up chalk, and on a dry day, the white light dust would blow in clouds from these lower fields. but those which lay furthest from his farm, near Miss Clare's cottage, had at least 2 feet of fertile topsoil, and here old Mr. Miller grew the oats and wheat which Miss Clare watched with an eye as keen and appreciative as their owners. At the moment, 100-acre field was brushed with a tender green, the tiny spears of wheat showing 2 or 3 inches above the soil. Beyond this field had lain a large expanse of kale, on which Mr. Miller had been feeding his flock during the hardest months of the winter. The 2 men walked slowly toward the kale stumps, stopping every now and again to bend down and examine the soil among the wheat rows. Miss Clare's long-sighted eyes noted their good thick tweeds approvingly. The wind was still keen despite the bright sunlight, and she liked to see people sensibly clad. But their shoes grieved her. They were stout enough, to be sure, but far more suited to the pavements of Caxley than the sticky mud of a beech-green field. And so beautifully polished. Such a pity to mess them up, thought Miss Clare, and what a lot of mud they would take back into that neat little car that stood on the green verge of the lane, quite near her own front gate. What could they be doing, she wondered. There they stood, with their backs to her, gazing across the grand sweep of the fields to the gentle outline of the hazy downs beyond. One had drawn a paper from his pocket and was studying it minutely. "What a busybody I'm getting," said Miss Clare aloud, pulling herself together. She took a last look round Miss Jackson's room, then crossed the little landing to her own at the front of the cottage. She had just finished setting it to rights and was shaking her duster from the window when she saw the 2 men again. They were standing now by the car, and, Miss Clare was glad to see, they were doing their best to wipe the mud from their shoes on the grass. Though why they don't pick up a little stick from the hedge and dig it all away from their insteps, I really don't know, said Miss Clare to herself. They will make a mess in that nice little car. She watched them climb in, turn it adroitly, and move off in the direction of Fairacre. "Curiouser and curiouser," quoted Miss Clare to the cat, who had arrived upstairs to see which bed had a pool of sunlight on it and would be best suited for his morning siesta. But his luck was out, for his mistress headed him firmly to the stairs and followed him into the kitchen. "Ministry of Agriculture, I should think," continued Miss Clare, lifting the cat onto his accustomed chair near the stove, from which, needless to say, the outraged animal jumped down at once just to assert his independence. His mistress was gazing somewhat easily out of the kitchen window. She was still preoccupied with the arrival of the 2 strangers. "I wonder who they can be, and what are they going to do in Fairacre?" At that moment in Fairacre, as Miss Clare had surmised, Miss Jackson and her young charges were pretending to be galloping horses in a small stony playground of Fairacre School. "Higher, higher," she urged the leaping children, prancing among them spiritedly, and her excited voice floated through the Gothic window, which was tilted open, to my own class. As headmistress of Fairacre School, I have taken the older children now for several years, while Miss Clare, then Miss Gray, now Mrs. Annette, and finally Miss Jackson held sway in the infants' room. Miss Jackson, to be sure, could be a thorn in the side at times, for she was still much influenced by her college psychology lecturer, and apt to thrust that good lady's dicta forward for my edification, much too often for my liking. But she had improved enormously, and I was inclined to think that her serene life with Miss Clare had had a lot to do with this mellowing process. My children were busy with sums, working away in their exercise books, with much rattling of nibs and inkwells and chewing of penholders. I walked to the window to watch the progress of Miss Jackson's galloping horses. The sun was dazzling. The weathercock glittered gold against the blue and white scudding sky on the spire of St. Patrick's Church, which stood a massive neighbor to our own small 2-roomed building. The children cavorted madly about, their faces rosy and their breath puffing mistily before them in the sharp air. Their short legs worked like pistons, and their hair was tossed this way and that, not only by their own exertions, but also by the exhilarating wind which came from the downs. Miss Jackson blew a wavering blast on her whistle, and the galloping horses stopped, panting in their tracks. It was at this moment that the little car drew cautiously alongside the school wall, and one of the two men inside called to Miss Jackson. I could not hear the conversation from my vantage point at the window, but I watched the children edge nearer the wall, as Miss Jackson, leaning well over, waved her arms authoritatively and presumably gave directions. Inquisitive little things, I thought to myself, and then was immediately struck by my own avid curiosity, which kept me staring with fascination at the scene before me. There's no doubt about it, we like to know what's going on in Fairacre, both young and old, and there's precious little that happens around us that goes unobserved. The men smiled their thanks, appeared to confer, and Miss Jackson turned back to her class, who were now clustered about her, well within earshot of her conversation. One of the men got out of the car and made his way towards the center of Fairacre. Miss Jackson resumed her lesson, and I, with smarting conscience, set about marking sums, much refreshed by my interlude at the school window. They had a flat tire, vouchsafed Miss Jackson over our cup of tea at playtime, and wanted to know if they could get some coffee anywhere while they had the wheel changed. I told them to try the Beetle and Wedge and to call on Mr. Rogers at the Ford about the wheel. They seem very nice men, she added, a trifle wistfully, I thought. I felt a slight pang of pity for my young assistant, who had so little opportunity of meeting very nice men. There are very few young men in Fairacre itself, and not many more at Beech Green, and buses to Caxley, the nearest town, are few and far between, even if one felt like making the effort to join the dramatic or musical society there. Occasionally, I knew, Miss Jackson went home for the weekend, and there I sincerely hoped she met some lively young people with their own interests. Unfortunately, it appeared from her chance remarks that Miss Crabbe still held first place in her heart, and if she could ever manage to visit this paragon, I knew that she did so. When I took my own class out for their PT lesson later in the morning, the little car was still there, and both men were busily engaged in changing the wheel themselves, so presumably no one had been forthcoming from Mr. Rogers at the forge. Before the end of my lesson, the job was completed. They wiped their hands on a filthy rag, looked very satisfied with themselves, and drove back on their tracks toward Caxley. "See them two strangers," shouted Mrs. Pringle an hour or so later, crashing plates about in the sink. Mrs. Pringle, the school cleaner, also washes up the dinner things and keeps us in touch with anything untoward that has happened in Fairacre during the morning. I said that I had. "Up to a bit of no good, I'll bet," continued Mrs. Pringle sourly. "Inspectors or something awkward like that. One went in the butcher's first. I thought perhaps he was the weights and measures, you know, for giving short weight. They has you up pretty smartish for giving short weight." I said I suppose they did. "And so they should," said Mrs. Pringle, rounding on me fiercely. "Nothing short of plain thieving to give short weight." She crashed the plates even more belligerently, her three chins wobbling aggressively, and her mouth turned down disapprovingly. "However," she went on heavily, "he wasn't the weights and measures, though his suit was good enough, that I must say. But he was asking for the forge. My cousin Dolly happened to be in the shop at the time, and she couldn't help overhearing as she was waiting for her fat to be cut off her chops. Too rich for her always, never been the same since yellow jaundice as a tot. But the butcher said he knew Mr. Rogers was gone to Caxley to put a wreath on his old mother's grave there, it being 5 years to the day since she passed on. As nice a woman as ever I wish to meet, and they keep her grave beautiful. So this fellow said was there anywhere to get a cup of coffee, and the butcher said no harm in having a bash at the Beetle, but it all depended." She turned to the electric copper, raised the lid, letting out a vast cloud of steam, bailed out a scalding dipperful of water, and flung it nonchalantly into the flotsam in the sink. "I passed him on my way up to the post office. Nicely turned out he was. Beautiful heather mixture tweed and a nice blue shirt with a fine red line to it. But his tie could have done with a clean. And his shoes! Had a good polish first thing, I don't doubt, but been tramping over some old plowed field since then. Couldn't help but notice, though I hardly give him a glance. I never was a starer, not like some in this parish I could mention." She bridled self-righteously and dropped a handful of red-hot forks with an ear-splitting crash onto the tin draining board. "Was that his car?" she bellowed above the din. I nodded. "They got a new-fangled thing, briefcase, ain't it, in the back? Two strangers poking about here with a briefcase and a lot of mud on their shoes, she mused. Makes you think, don't it? Might be ag men, of course, but you mark my words, Miss Reed, they was up to no good. Mr. Willett, the school caretaker, verger, and sexton of St. Patrick's next door, and general handyman to all Fairacre, had also noticed the strangers. Nice little car, that, outside here this morning. Them two chaps from the office? The office, which is always spoken of with the greatest respect, referred in this case to the Divisional Educational Office in Caxley, from which forms, directions, and our monthly checks flutter regularly. No, I said, I don't know who they were. Oh, Lor, said Mr. Willett, blowing out his mustache despairingly. Hope it ain't anything to do with the sanitary. They're terrors, the sanitary. Ah, well, time will tell, I suppose, but they looked uncomfortable sort of customers to me. He trudged off with resigned good humor to sweep up the playground. But it remained for the Reverend Gerald Partridge, vicar of Fairacre and Beech Green, to say the last word on this mysterious subject. Did you have visitors this morning? He asked after he had greeted the children. I told him that we had not seen anyone strange in school. I noticed two men in a little car outside here as I drove over to see about poor old Harris's funeral at Beech Green. Now I wonder who they could have been. I said I had no idea. Who knows, said the vicar happily. We may look forward to having some new people among us, perhaps. As it happened, the vicar spoke more truly than he knew. Chapter 2. Fairacre's Daily Round. By next day, of course, the two strangers were forgotten. Life, particularly in a village, has so many interests that each day seems to offer more riches than the last. Miss Clare turned her attention to a magnificent steak and kidney pudding, which simmered gently on her stove from 2 o'clock onward, for her lodgers and her own supper together at 8 o'clock. It filled the little house with its homely fragrance, and Dr. Martin, who called in hopefully about 3:30 for a cup of tea with his old friend and patient, noticed it at once. That's the stuff, he said approvingly, rubbing his hands, and he cast a glance at Miss Clare's spare frame. You're putting on weight since that girl came. Good idea of yours to have a lodger. It had not been Miss Clare's idea at all, and they both knew that very well. But Miss Clare let it pass. It was Dr. Martin who had engineered Miss Jackson's removal from her headmistress's house to Miss Clare's, and he could see that young company, as well as an addition to her slender housekeeping purse, was doing his patient all the good in the world. Have a ginger nut, said Miss Clare, pushing the massive biscuit barrel across to him. I'll have to dip it. My new bottom set's giving me hell, said the doctor with disarming frankness. We're getting old, Dolly. That's our trouble. They smiled across at each other and sipped their tea in comfortable silence. The steak and kidney pudding sizzled deliciously on the stove. The fire warmed their thin legs, and though indeed, thought Miss Clare, we're both old and white-haired, at least we're very happy. Mrs. Pringle was busy washing out the school tea-cloths at her own sink. This was done every day, but on this occasion Mrs. Pringle was particularly engrossed, for it was the first time that she had used what she termed one of these newfangled deterrents. The staunch upholder of Yellow Bar soap, Mrs. Pringle had set her face against the dazzling array of washing powders which brightened the grocer's shop. On a wooden shelf above her sink were stacked long bars as hard as wood, which she had stored there for many months. This soap was used for all cleaning purposes in the Pringle household. The brick floors, the stout undergarments, and Mrs. Pringle's dour countenance itself were all scoured with this substance, and when one piece had worn away, Mrs. Pringle fetched her shovel, laid a bar on a piece of newspaper on the kitchen floor, and sliced another chunk off to do its work. But the gay coupons, all assuring her of their monetary value, which fluttered through Mrs. Pringle's letterbox from time to time, gradually found a chink in her armor. The day came when, slightly truculent, she handed one across the counter and put the dazzling packet in her basket. She was careful to cover it with other packages in case she met neighbors who, knowing her former scorn of these products, would be only too pleased to take a rise out of her if they saw that she had finally fallen. And so, on this day, Mrs. Pringle washed her tea cloths with a critical eye. The packet had been tucked away behind the innocent bars of soap, for Mrs. Pringle had no doubt that her husband and grown-up son could be equally offensive as her neighbors about this experiment if they caught sight of the soap powder. "Huh," said Mrs. Pringle grudgingly as she folded up the wet tea towels and put them into her laundry basket. "Don't do so bad after all." With some pride, she trudged up the garden and began to peg out the cloths on the line. When she had done this, she propped the line up with a sturdy forked hazel branch and surveyed the fluttering collection. "Might be something to be said for these deterrents, after all," she told herself, returning to the cottage. "And it do save chipping up the soap, that I will give 'em." It was indeed high praise. Miss Jackson, in the infant's room at Fairacre, was embarking on the most elaborate and artistic frieze yet attempted by her class. It was to go all around the room, fixed with drawing pins to the green-painted matching board, and was to represent spring. The children were busy snipping with their blunt-nosed little scissors, which were always much too stiff for small children to manage properly, at gummed paper in all the colors of the rainbow. "Make just what you like," Miss Jackson had exhorted them. "Flowers, leaves, lambs, birds, butterflies, anything that makes you think of spring." Most of the class had flung themselves with abandon into this glorious snipping session, but there were, as always, one or two stolid and adenoidal babies who were completely without imagination and awaited direction apathetically. "Make grass, then," had said Miss Jackson, with some exasperation to the Coggs twins, who sat with glum, dark eyes fixed upon her. 10 minutes later, she found that a large mound of green snippings lay on the desk between them, while, with tongues protruding and a red ring round each hard-working thumb, the grass-makers added painfully to their pile. "Anyway," thought Miss Jackson, "that's far better than making them go step by step drawing round tobacco tins and paste jars to make horrid little yellow chicks in a row for an Easter frieze." For she had found just such a one, made by her predecessor Mrs. Annett, and had looked scornfully upon its charming regularity. The children, needless to say, had loved it, but Miss Jackson favored all those things which were written in capital letters in her own teaching notes, such as free art, individual expression, untrammeled creative urge, and so on. And anything as formal and limited as poor Mrs. Annett's despised chicks were anathema to her. And so the children snipped and hacked and tore at a fine profusion of gummed papers. Mrs. Annett's and Miss Clare's frugal eyes would have expressed concern at the large pieces which fell to waste on the floor. But Miss Jackson, seeing in her mind's eye the riotous glory which was to flower around her walls so soon, and with a fine disregard for the ratepayers' money, smiled upon her baby's efforts with approval. And we'll follow them further into spring next time.